A while ago, I got a job at a small hospital just outside of town. I was excited, as it was my first job I'd been offered since my schooling. It was just casual work, but I was still ecstatic at the chance to work there, as the money was pretty great, and it was the place that I did my practicum at. Most of the time, I would do 12-hour shifts, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Sometimes, though, I would be given the 3 to 11 p.m. shifts. I didn't care for those much. I was used to working late from my previous job, but I had to drive a lot further to get home, and the late shifts are very slow usually. Another reason I didn't like them much was because there weren't very many people on staff, and I could get pretty lonely. Usually 4 nurses and 1 admin, me, and the emergency doctor. That's about it. Now, being in a small hospital like this one, you see some pretty strange things come in. Some people can't make it into the city, and so we've had the emergency STARS helicopter have to drop in every now and then. I've seen some terrible things, like whole families dying from accidents on curved country roads. I've even had people bring in animals in desperation, as there was no vet nearby that was open. This one particular night, around 10 p.m., I was sitting and talking with one of the RNs about a patient's chart, but mostly just wasting time until I could go home at 11. The hospital was quiet, and I'd only checked around 6 people into emergency at this point. I remember I was eating my yogurt, and I heard a strange noise coming from the main doors. I saw a man walking towards us. He looked mostly normal, but he had a long coat on, which was strange as it was the middle of summer, and even though it was dark out, it was still relatively warm. The RN next to me sighed and got up to go to the bathroom, leaving me to attend to our new arrival. As he drew closer, the strange sound got louder, and something caught the light. He was dragging something behind him that I couldn't quite make out, but I assumed it to be metal by the noise it was making. It sent a shiver up my spine. He stopped at the desk, and I could see his eyes were wide and his pupils were huge. His face was pale, and he looked like he hadn't slept in a very long time. I'd seen this look many times, and immediately associated it with someone who was high on something. He leaned on the desk and ran his fingers through his hair, pulling at it and grinding his teeth. When people like this come in, they're usually looking for drugs. Most of the time they'll complain of a migraine or fibromyalgia, anything we can't prove the contrary of. I processed him as usual, and noticed that he was getting more and more irritable as time passed. Eventually, when I finished and pointed him towards the waiting area, he asked me how long it would be. Knowing that the on-call doc had gone on a quick break, I estimated about half an hour. That's when his whole demeanor changed. The anger on his face was obvious as he stormed over to the waiting area, which is a room between emergency and the front desk area with doors. As he walked away, I got a glimpse of what he was dragging, and I came to the quick realization that it was an axe. I panicked and almost called the code over the paging system, but I didn't want him to realize I had noticed. I promptly called the police on my cell phone and ran down the hall to signal to the nurses that we had an issue. The police would have to come from 2 towns over, which takes on average 20 minutes. Of course, as we are small girls, we didn't want to go anywhere near him. He was tall and very muscular. Even all combined, we probably wouldn't have stood a chance. I calmly walked back to the front desk and paged the doctor, asking him to call me. I waited and waited, but never got a response from him. I watched this man getting more agitated, and soon he started yelling and asking for help. We hid from him, not wanting him to come back to us, and we devised a plan to lock him in the waiting area. The glass in there is reinforced, and the doors are pretty heavy, so it should hold him in there until the police arrived. The plan went down without a hitch, until the man realized what we'd done. He started screaming and throwing chairs around the room, He was alone, so we didn't have to worry about him hurting anyone. Then he started using his axe on the front door and the glass to the front desk area where we were all standing and watching. I've never been so terrified in my life, and what made it even worse was the fact that he was making some headway on the door. It was at this time that the emergency doctor walks in the front door of the hospital, sipping on a drink from the Mac's over the road. He saw us all huddled behind the desk, and thankfully, he quickly took charge of the situation. After getting all the necessary information, he disappeared towards the back entrance of emergency, the way ambulance bring patients in. He unlocked the door of the waiting room and tackled the man to the floor when he wasn't looking, then proceeded to tie him up with the cable ties. He sat on his back until the cops finally arrived. I was so thankful to have that young, physically fit doc with us that night. I bought him coffee every time our schedules crossed as a thank you, but I don't think it would ever be enough. As this was the second incident that went down for me as I worked a late shift, I decided to never work late shifts again. Now I'm a Monday to Friday 9 to 5 worker. Much safer that way. I figured I would share and see what you all thought of my hospital roommate. For a little background, when I was 15, I was put in short-term psychiatric inpatient at the hospital in my town. It was because I tried to kill myself, followed by a small breakdown in partial inpatient, which is basically inpatient where you go home to sleep. After the breakdown in partial, they put me in full inpatient. It was during this time that my diagnosis was switched from depression to bipolar, and I haven't been back to inpatient since. But I was definitely very unstable at the time, so this all really freaked me out. The way the bedrooms were laid out, there would be 2 bedrooms with separate entrances, connected to a small foyer, with an open doorway in the main hall. No one was allowed into our private bedroom space, except yourself, and only the 2 people in the bedrooms connected to it were allowed in the foyer. For my 3 days, I had a really nice roommate named Amber. Amber and I would sit in our foyer and talk, mostly about the things we were dealing with. On my 3rd day, Amber was sent home. I was bummed because as a result, I had no one who I could share space with. I spent my 3rd night alone. On the evening of my 4th day, a new girl came into inpatient, named Jade. Being a girl, she was put in my room block, rather than the other empty space where her roommate would have been a guy. The ward was co-ed, but the room blocks were gender specific. She was 14, a year younger than I was, and appeared to be Filipino in ethnicity. She had long dark hair that went halfway down her back, and seemed very quiet. I was very polite to her, mainly since I was happy to not be alone in my block anymore. She didn't talk a whole lot for the first hour or so that she was there, but when we went to our block pre-bedtime, we got half an hour to just sit and talk in our foyers before bed. She explained to me why she was there. You see, the thing about her was that she seemed pretty normal up until she talked. The second she started talking, I felt immediately creeped out. It's not what she was saying that was all that weird. It was the way that she talked. There was an edge to her voice that wasn't quite right. It made her seem almost unresponsive to what she was saying. Her mannerisms seemed ever so slightly forced. She went on to basically tell me that she and her friends had gotten really drunk, and while running around doing drunk people things, she got caught and put in inpatient. That in and of itself didn't add up at all. You don't get put in inpatient for getting drunk with your friends. But a lot of people had bogus stories about how they'd gotten in, so I just sort of shrugged it off. She was very quiet most of the following day. That evening, when TV time was about to start, Jade and I were sitting in the TV room with a 3rd girl from inpatient named Ruby. You see, Ruby and I actually ended up being friends in the outside world, after coincidentally seeing each other again over a year after our stay. We ended up reminiscing about the incident with Jade, which Ruby also recalled. The three of us were alone in the room, because the staff had walked out for a minute to talk to the desk person just outside of the room. She was within view, but more than likely couldn't really hear the conversation. Ruby, Jade, and I were all sitting on the couch. I was in the middle, with Ruby to my right and Jade to my left. Ruby and I were talking about cats on the outside. We were both missing our pets, and it was common for the teens and inpatient to talk about the things they loved the most on the outside. Jade wasn't really in the conversation, but suddenly piped up saying that she hated cats. She went on to tell a story about how a stray had once scratched her, so she killed it and chopped it up, then left the bits in the woods. If the story wasn't creepy enough on its own, recall how I described her demeanor. She said this all as though she could have been ordering a cup of coffee or talking about the weather. It was horrifying. Ruby and I exchanged a look, and one of us, I don't recall which, asked about whether that was the first time she had actually killed something. She responded that it wasn't, and that she liked to kill small animals all the time, usually cats, because she hated them. Within the next minute, the staff person came back into the room. Ruby and I were still relatively floored by the incident. The staff was unaware of what had been said, and we didn't really mention it. Fortunately, I left the hospital only 3 days later, and 2 of them were spent in a different room because an ant problem was discovered in my original room. I haven't seen Jade since, but I can't help but wonder if she's out there killing people or something. I like to pretend that she was just screwing with us in some sort of sick, demented way. At least that way, she would just be a girl with a fucked up sense of humor, rather than an actual psycho cat killer. Okay, this is my first time posting, so I hope it all makes sense. So to give you a bit of backstory, a few years ago I started to suffer with a lot of stomach problems. Fast forward 4 years, and it turns out I've got a stomach ulcer. Not ideal. Anyway, last summer I had to spend a night in the hospital running some tests on it, and the main hospital isn't in my town, so my boyfriend offered to drive me up. We got there quite late, probably around 9 p.m., and when I arrived, the nurse mentioned that my boyfriend couldn't stay. I didn't like the idea of staying alone, mainly because I hate hospitals, so he offered to stay until they kicked him out. We fell asleep and got woken up about 6 a.m. by one of the nurses, explaining that they'd forgotten to ask my partner to leave, and even though she didn't mind, the head nurse would be on her way shortly to do her morning rounds, and I shouldn't have had a visitor in my room. So my boyfriend offered to go down to the car for a few hours to sleep more, and once they'd finished the tests, they let me go. Anyways, this is where it gets weird. About 5 minutes into leaving, this random guy walks into my room and sits down, telling me the nurses asked him to come in here. I know it sounds stupid, but I guess I was in shock for a few minutes, because I sort of believed him. And then I started probing him, and his answer was the same. He was asked to sit in here. By now, my fight or flight kicks in. Well, sort of, and I ran into the bathroom with my phone. Don't ask why I didn't run into the corridor. Again, I clearly don't cope well with these situations. So I get to the bathroom and call my boyfriend, who is crazy protective of me, and tell him what's happened. He immediately makes his way back from the car. At this point from the bathroom, I can hear shouting. What's this young girl's name? What age is she? I don't know who he's shouting to because no one is answering him. Thankfully, I can hear my boyfriend coming back into the room and asking the guy who he was. And this must have startled him because he ran off down the hall. When I came out of the bathroom, I noticed my boyfriend had a horrified look on his face. What I should have also mentioned is that I wear contacts, but had taken them out before falling asleep. So between not having full sight, and in my panic, I'd missed that the man's hands, feet, and clothes had blood on them, because he left a small trail of blood across the floor, across the wall, and onto the chair he was sat on. At this point, I went down to the hall nurse's station, still a little in shock, and explained what happened. Right away, someone came up to clean the mess, but again, they asked my boyfriend to leave, something he wasn't exactly happy about. The nurses were clearly trying to keep me calm as they tried to make light of it, but I knew something wasn't right, and at this stage, I've realized the guy is actually keeping a close eye on my room, because no sooner than my boyfriend had left, the man walked back in, closed the door, and began walking towards me sitting on the bed. Thankfully, the nurse was present this time and demanded the man leave. I don't think they'd taken me too seriously until now, but finally they noticed that having a bloodied man continuously trying to break into my room was shaking me, and they told me it was safer to have my boyfriend with me, as he must have been the guy's biggest deterrent. Rightly so, because for the rest of the morning, the guy kept walking past my room trying to peer through to see if my partner was still there. He eventually gave up or was sent somewhere else. I finished my tests and was allowed home. The nurses tried to tell me the guy had a head injury, which was the reason he was in the hospital, but they were obviously worried enough for my safety to let my boyfriend stay in the room. Anyways, what worries me the most is that the guy was definitely watching my room, because every time my boyfriend left, he came in right away. It doesn't help thinking about what would have happened if the nurses had kicked my boyfriend out in the middle of the night. I was in the hospital for about 10 days, suffering from a kidney infection. My mother visited me, but the rest of the family were too busy, so I was pretty lonely and in pain. I used to keep in touch with my friends and family by mobile phone. Hospitals over the last 10 years allowed the use of mobile phones. There was a young male student doctor who was chatty and friendly to all the patients. I can't really remember his name, so I'm just going to call him Edward. Whilst attending the ward, Edward used to chat with me. He was very intelligent and a nice and decent chap. He gave me a get well soon card to cheer me up. The other female patient teased Edward and said that he should ask me out. I made it very clear at this point to Edward that I didn't really fancy him at all. I told him he was like a brother to me. Edward laughed at what the lady said. He assured me that he didn't really fancy me either, and said that a patient-doctor relationship was unethical anyway. After 10 days, I felt better. The doctors discharged me, and I said my goodbyes to the other patients and to Edward, and wished him well in his studies and career. I called the taxi to take me home. At this point, I had put my mobile phone on silent. When I reached my house, I checked my phone and saw that I'd missed 8 calls from a number I didn't recognize. I was puzzled, but didn't think too much of it. I thought I'd ring the number the next day, so I had a shower and just went to bed. The next morning, I checked my phone again. I realized I'd forgotten to put the ringer back on, and I'd seen that I'd had another 10 missed calls. I called the number, and a man answered the phone. To my surprise, it was Edward. I was a bit annoyed, and I asked Edward how he'd gotten my number. He told me that I'd given it to him. I told him that I hadn't, and he insisted so much that I had, that I even began to doubt myself. In the hospital, I was in a lot of pain and doped up with morphine most of the time. Anyway, Edward and I chatted on the phone for a while, and he called me back a few days later. At this point, I was recuperating at home, and Edward would call me every few days. One day, I told him that I couldn't talk, as I was still not well but needed to go food shopping before the shops closed. Edward offered to shop for me and bring the food to my place. I politely declined. After this, Edward started calling me every day. I often didn't take his calls. He texted me, saying that he needed to talk because his mother was ill, but when I answered his next call, he told me he had just said that because he wanted to talk to me. He said that he knew I had a hospital appointment in a few days' time, and that he would meet me there. He told me that he had a new mobile phone for me, and would put me on his family plan. I asked him how he knew that I had an appointment, and he told me that he'd accessed my medical records. I didn't attend the hospital appointment, as I really didn't want to see Edward. I told Edward that I didn't want any more contact with him, and to leave me alone. At this point, Edward told me that he loved me, and wanted to marry me. He just kept on calling and calling me, and I refused to take his calls. In one day, I'd have maybe 40 missed calls, and 60 text messages from him. He even called me during the middle of the night sometimes. At this point, I was creeped out and beginning to get really scared. One day, I had a call from an unknown number. It was Edward again. He kept changing his number so that he knew I'd pick it up. I was really scared now. I told the police, but they said there was nothing they could do, as he was not threatening me. Edward kept changing his number using pay-as-you-go phone chips, so it was hard to prove that it was actually him phoning me. I felt that Edward could get nasty and dangerous at this point. I was particularly scared as my mom pointed out to me that he could find out where I lived by checking my medical records. I asked a good male friend of mine to answer Edward's phone call to me and pretend that he was my new boyfriend. That didn't work, and Edward didn't believe it. At this point, I was at my wit's end. I wasn't sleeping or eating, and I was terrified. I always had friends over to stay with me, and I made sure that I was never alone. One morning, I woke up, and instead of fear, I was just angry. How dare that stupid little coward bully me and totally take over and ruin my life? I telephoned him, and I was very firm and assertive. I told him that if he ever contacted me again, I would report him to the dean of his university. I would send the dean all of the text messages that he'd written me, and I told him that his career as a doctor would be over. From that day on, Edward never contacted me again. I was so relieved that I could finally lead a normal life again. What's up, guys? Blue Spooky here, as always. I just wanted to thank you guys for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end here. If you liked the video, please feel free to leave a comment or like. And if you have any stories that you'd like me to read or that you'd like to send in, please feel free to send me a message on any of my social media accounts. They can all be found in the description below the video. There will be links to my Facebook, Twitter, as well as my email. So go ahead and shoot me a message on one of those, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. If you have any constructive criticism, please feel free to leave it in the comments below, as I'm always looking for ways to improve the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.